Thank you everyone for joining us today. A few traditional Zoom troubles at the beginning, but hopefully we'll manage to get all our speakers up, and we have some really interesting panelists joining today. And we decided to put this event together, to throw it together very quickly, because it does feel like in the past couple of weeks, history just seems to be accelerating. From the war in Ukraine to the battlegrounds of Syria, from the streets of Tbilisi to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump hasn't even moved back into the White House, and we seem to already be witnessing a total transformation of the global order. Tonight, we're coming to you live from Tbilisi, where streets have looked like this for the past 2 weeks. Tens of thousands of people, night after night. I flew back from New York because of what's happening here feels different from countless protests that I've covered in over 2 decades as a journalist. Led by the youth, protests have been going strong despite freezing temperatures and really unprecedented police brutality. Also water cannons, tear gas, beatings, arrests. But people keep coming out because they're furious with the government here, which they say not only stole the recent election, but also shelved Georgia's EU aspirations. Breaking its own promise and violating the constitution, integration into the EU is actually written into the country's constitution. Because alternative to the EU is Russia, and it's Georgia's old colonial master, which has already occupied 20% of the country. Borrowing from Moscow's playbook, the government has been targeting journalists, passing repressive laws, arresting people. This is Luka Gviniashvili. Luka was an intern with us, actually, and has been writing a brilliant diary from the protests for us. And those of you who came to ZEG Fest last year, you might remember his really great performance. He was arrested 2 days ago, along with more than 500 others. We'll have a chance to learn more today about the resistance to the crackdown, about how it fits into the much bigger global picture. But for now, we just want to give you a little taste of what it's all like in the streets of Tbilisi right now. So we're going to go live to Masha Lomashvili, who is out in the streets. Masha, if you can hear us, maybe you can...
Natalia.
Hi. Oh, yeah, and we can give us a taste of what's happening right now.
Hi, everyone. So I'm here in front of the parliament now. It's freezing cold here, but despite the weather, we still have thousands of people coming on the streets. We have people bringing tea, coffee, soups, all kinds of snacks so that they can sustain the protest in these conditions. You can see the crowd behind me. We have people over there doing what Georgians are best at. They're performing Georgian polyphony songs. But most importantly, in these few weeks, Georgians had to learn something that they're actually not best at, which is logistics. And they managed to move the protest now away from the parliament. And we have protests going on throughout the whole day. We have people walking out from their, doing walkouts from their work. We have people marching on the streets, paralyzing the whole capital, basically. We had yesterday and today people from industries like lawyers, doctors, IT specialists, even animal rights defenders staging the marches. And basically, there is no sign of this stopping anytime soon. People here are telling me that the stakes are too high and they don't want to compromise. The demand stays the same, which is getting rid of the current government, and they are demanding new elections. Unfortunately, the situation on the other side is the same. The government doesn't want to budge, and the pro-Russian government run by the oligarch Zeina Shahla is only seeming to accelerate the crackdown on the protesters. It's basically a stalemate at this point, and the protesters are worried that without international attention and the pressure from the West, they have very slim chances at pushing their goals through. That is the current situation here.
Thanks, Masha. And Masha will stay on if you have questions for her. So, but keep warm if you can, if it's possible. It is very
my camera is shaking because it's freezing here, but I'll try my best.
Put the phone in the pocket. But the international attention is definitely something that everyone's talking about. And one of the reasons, sometimes the reasons for the lack of it can be, there are many, but sometimes some can be quite sort of trivial, and not that I'm calling the events while in Syria trivial, quite the opposite, but so many journalists who were here or on the way here now rerouted themselves and are now in Syria, where obviously Bashar al-Assad's regime came to an abrupt and really, really dramatic end, rewriting history of the entire region. And it's been really fascinating to see how much connection the protesters who are out in Tbilisi see with what's happening with Syria, and we'll talk more about it. But Zeina, I'm so delighted that you're able to join us from Damascus today.
Thank
You. It's been just so incredible to see the 50 years of this, one of the most brutal dictatorships the world has ever seen, crumble the way that it did. And even, everyone here is talking about it as well. Sort of as we saw the Russian tanks leaving Syria, people here are wondering, well, are they going to be coming here? Half joking, but with a little bit of worry as well. But before anything else, like what has the past, it's now been a week, right? A week of something that most Syrians could never imagine. What is it like in Damascus now?
Yeah, it is like something I have never imagined to live in Syria. So I stayed in Damascus the whole years of the revolution, of the war. But this week is nothing like anything else. So it changed. Like the first 2 days were very violent. We had some chaos in the streets. But now, today I was in the streets since the morning. So life is becoming somehow normal. People came back to their work, to their universities. There was a huge demonstration in the universities. Thousands of students were out in the street chanting, dancing, and celebrating. Shops are open, hospitals. So yeah, somehow the life is getting normal, but everyone is also still waiting because we don't know what the coming days are holding for us. We are still like following the news of this new transitional government. We are worried somehow because the future is still somehow ambiguous. But I can say that this week, at least in Damascus, where I live, was a week of celebration, mostly a week of relief. Everyone is really relieved because we, as you said, we get rid of a dictatorship that was ruining the whole country and our whole life. And also, we are still waiting for the news from the detainees because I think if you were following, we have more than 100,000 disappeared persons in Syria, but until now, only few thousands came out from prison. So we are still waiting for the news. We are still waiting to organize because the process of searching for those missed people in the prison, especially Sadnaya prison, the notorious prison in rural Damascus, the search process is still chaotic. We still need to organize it. I'm meeting each day people who have missed persons, and they say, we don't know where to go. We're still searching for our beloved ones in hospitals, in prisons. So the chaotic scene is still present in Damascus, but somehow it's becoming to be organized day by day.
And I imagine, I imagine everyone is still processing, and it will take a while to process what just happened. And it's just feels like a situation that's sort of pregnant with so much opportunity and so much risk as well. What are people most worried about if they started worrying about things as opposed being euphoric about what happened? What is kind of the greatest risk as people see it now?
Yeah, we have a lot of things to worry about. So each person has different priorities. Like people have economic priorities because we have been living in very harsh economic situation since, let me say, especially in the past 4 years because of the sanctions, because of the war. So people are really worried about the economic situation. Is it going to be improved? Is the economy will be more open? What about education? What about working opportunities? And also we are worried about freedom of speech, about personal freedoms, about women freedoms, about a lot of things. So because I think it's a historic moment in Syria. So now we have a rare chance to build something that unites all Syrian and lead us to a better future. Of course, the situation is not perfect. We are talking about a country that was really devastated by the war in the past decades. And so it's not going to happen in one night and one day, just like to rid of a government and a regime, then replace it with another one. We need a lot of work, and everyone in the Syrian community need to participate, because this will ensure that the Syria we are dreaming of, it's going to be inclusive for everyone.
I want to bring in Oz Katerji. Oz is a British Lebanese journalist who is based normally in Kiev, and he's now, I believe, on a bus going back to Kiev, and he's going back to Kiev from Damascus. Oz, really keen to hear from you. You bring together these two perspectives, both sort of Ukraine and the Middle East at the moment. Just give us a few thoughts on, how what you saw in Damascus over the past few days, how does that fit with what you are seeing in Ukraine today, where you're based?
Well, look, I'm not sure the comparisons between what's happening in Damascus and the comparisons between what's happening in Ukraine are visible on the ground today, as it were. It's a much more geopolitical similarity between them because of the actors that are involved. Obviously, Iranian drones are bombing Ukrainian cities and Russian soldiers are invading Ukraine. But this really did feel like this was a slide backwards for autocracy. The story of the last 10 years had been autocrats in the ascendancy. And the intervention in Syria by Russia and Iran turned the tide of Assad in the ascendancy, and that seemed to be the story of the last decade or so. So for this all to be undone in 13 days is a real shockwave to the international community in general, really. And I think it just goes to show that the people that said this regime was being propped up by foreign intervention solely were proven absolutely correct. You couldn't force a regime against the people that had already rejected it, and it didn't have the military capability to subjugate its people without foreign powers. And this all fits into what's happening elsewhere. The post-October 7th conflict between Israel, Hamas, and Iran's militias, and the invasion of Ukraine. Without the backdrop of these things happening, the rebels might not have been in a position to make the move that they did, or rather, at least they wouldn't have been in the position to achieve the stunning success that they did. So those are really the similarities in the actors that were involved in. What I saw in Damascus is the people free for the first time in their lives. One young girl, must have been a teenager, came up to us as press and spoke to us in English and said it was the first time she'd ever spoken English in public. And lots of people were expressing themselves in public for the first time in their entire lives. And this is the regime of silence that had been that had collapsed around them, suddenly freeing them and lifting these people to a place where they feel confident, speaking in public again. And this is a remarkable event for the world, a remarkable moment in history. And I was proud to be there. I'm currently on a night bus on the way back to Kiev. Obviously there's no flights out of Damascus and there's no flights into Ukraine, so it's a very complicated process of getting to and from. But I will say that I do think this series of events has struck a hammer blow at the kind of the way Putin in particular has been providing a sort of dictatorship protection service that really started in earnest in Syria. And now that has been rolled back, it's put a real dent in Putin's projection of both hard and soft power, not only in the Middle East, but this will probably affect operations in Africa, where Putin has also been propping up dictatorships and involving himself in civil wars. And without the naval bases and without the military bases, the naval base in Tartus and the air base in Latakia, That's now going to be harder. Less places to deliver places, less places to refuel. No warm water port after they've been pushed out of the Black Sea. So look, it depends what really happens with the territorial support. That still remains to be seen. But in either case, even if they do keep the port in some diminished way, I do think it's fair to say that both Russia and Iran and autocracies globally have suffered a major setback in what's happened in Syria over the last 2 weeks.
You know, to me, watching it from, and I can see your questions coming in, and please keep them coming. We are going to try our hardest to get to as many of them as we can. But to me, watching all of it, I just can't help but wonder whether, like, and it's not just in Georgia and in Syria, extraordinary events in South Korea, incredible events in Romania, where the Supreme Court canceled upcoming second round of the presidential election because of the Russian interference, taking a very sort of clear stand against the election interference. So it almost feels like, you know, there is this like final and urgent bid for justice and influence before whatever this next iteration of Trump era world order comes in and settles in. There's a lot of sort of people power happening at the moment, but the man coming into the White House, elected democratically, also has clear authoritarian tendencies. So I wonder, Ed, maybe this is a question, Peter, it's great that you managed to beat Zoom and come on, join us. Very glad to see you. But since you just joined us, let me bring Edward Lucas in. And what do you think? Is that what it is? Is that sort of that rush for influence before the dark clouds gather, or are we entering some sort of, you know, what Oz mentioned, kind of like a retreat of authoritarianism?
I think that the first thing I'd say is it's a huge test for Kaja Kallas and the new EU leadership. This has landed slap bang on her desk, and we've been complaining for some time that the EU punches massively below its weight in all sorts of places, not just Ukraine and Georgia, but also Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere. So it'll be interesting to see how the new team gets on with that. I think that there's a huge range of possibilities about the Trump administration, and literally nobody knows because Trump himself doesn't know. He likes that sort of chaos, lots of competing people, lots of competing ideas, and he has a very instinctive sort of gut approach to politics, and he will go with his gut. I think the big question for the Europeans will be how the NATO summit in the summer in The Hague turns out, and I think Trump will arrive there breathing fire, wanting to humiliate and chastise the Europeans, at least for the cameras. What happens behind the scenes will be another question. I think there's a kind of vacuum around Syria, really, at the moment. I don't see anyone really getting involved other than Turkey, who obviously got this kind of big line into the new dominant force there. And of course, Israel, which is making the most of the opportunity. But I think that the clouds are still heavy over there. And I'm just so sad about Georgia. And I listen with enormous interest and sympathy to the voices from there. And I see, it'd be interesting to know whether there's any sign of the army changing. I see senior military officers saying that soldiers should obey their oath and not Ivanishvili. But
Let me just interrupt you for a second and throw it to Batu Kutelia, who was the former Georgian ambassador to the US and held many other government positions in the previous government, and Mariam, I believe, yes, Nikuradze, who's a journalist. Question for both of you: should Edward Lucas be sad about Georgia? Mariam, you want to go first?
I will allow Batu because, like, I think he knows better about the military part, and then I can jump in.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me. Ed, great to see you. I think we should not be sad for Georgia for now, because Georgian nation is exercising its right to defend its choice of democracy. And there is a hope that this will prevail, and that's what we see on the streets of Tbilisi right now. So, but the situation is rather grim, and the situation is grim because this is not something that happened overnight. We've been observing Georgia sliding towards authoritarian or even Russian type of state capture in a very slow pace since 2012, and this process has accelerated after Russian invasion in Ukraine. So yes, the question is right. All these issues are interconnected. Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, what is happening or possibly was planned to happen in Romania, Syria. So it's a big geopolitical question that is linked to the geopolitics, authoritarianism versus democracy, also access to the resources, or in a short kind of a war or battle that authoritarians declared on democracy, especially since 2007 when Putin announced this battle at the Munich Security Conference. And Georgia was even the first victim of this battle in 2008. So this is a long-standing problem, but now somehow we reach the climax of this battle. In some cases, we have good news. In some cases, situation is in limbo. And among those, Georgia is the weakest link, because we see almost successful state capture that was supposed to be finalized or legitimized by the fundamentally rigged elections in Georgia. And again, as I said, and we often repeat it to our friends, that Georgia is more than Georgia. It's not only about a small, tiny nation on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, but it's a part of a bigger equation, and where besides the value component, we have a pragmatic interests of democratic world. First of all, to make democracy inspiring again and not to let authoritarian strike yet another success story. Because if we observe the last several years, we had some kind of an authoritarian map globally. But if Georgia flips around, there will be +1 authoritarian country, the worst form of it.
But how do you continue with that rhetoric and with that faith? And Mariam, if you could do it briefly, and then Mariam, it's kind of like same continuation of the question. How do you like carry on doing that when the country is so reliant and has been on the United States, and ultimately the new administration in the US is, washing its hands and saying we're done here? How do you square that?
Well, first of all, as I said, it's not only about Georgia or helping Georgian democracy to survive, but it's in a Western interest. So it's not some kind of a charity of helping us, but West has a vital interest. US has a vital interest in the wider Black Sea region. Europe has a vital interest in the Black Sea region. And besides the European Union, for example, the United Kingdom has vital interest in this region. One component of this interest is access to the Central Asia and having a implementing its geopolitical imperative. This spring, UK former foreign secretary was traveling in Central Asia, first ever foreign secretary traveling there, admitting that it should have been done much earlier, because for all those important components that Europe and democratic world has in their agenda, besides peace and security, whether it's a decarbonization, green economy, or ramping up military production, resources and minerals are the key. And one of the key hotbed of these minerals in Central Asia, which is now under either Russian control or potentially China substituting this control. And without having logistical access to the region, I do not see any other way of West benefiting of it. So, and the Black Sea is the key linchpin to connecting to that very important area of heartland, as Mackinder labeled it.
Mariam, let me bring you in
Mhm.
briefly. And Oleksandra, thank you so much for joining. It's great to have you with us, and we'll come to you next, and then Peter. But Mariam, the same. Do you feel like there is some sort of deadline for the protesters in the streets? I mean, last time we had you during our event, since the last time in the spring, you came and you spoke, and now there's a criminal case against you. You're facing arrest. The violence against protesters has been the deterioration, kind of erosion of basic rights has been so dramatic. Do you feel, I referred earlier to this like rush for a little bit of influence before Trump sort of gets into the White House? Do you feel that? Do you feel that you need to like carve out a stronger space for yourself in Georgia before the unpredictable new administration comes in?
Yeah, so first of all, I think if there is a deadline, it's Georgian dream thinking about Trump coming officially to power. That's for them, but I don't feel like there is any kind of deadline for the protesters. Like to give our listeners the idea, just 2 hours ago, I was at the demonstration where there were Barcelona and Real Madrid fans together marching towards Rustaveli. It's insane what is going on. I don't see the spirit of protesters dying anytime soon. If anything, they are getting more inspired to be in the streets and to win this battle every day. And yesterday was a great example of that when, it was so-called elections, or rather appointment of the so-called president of Georgian Dream, right? It was the morning half, and the evening half was supposed to be the Tbilisi mayor lighting the Christmas tree celebration. And they were quite convinced that they would be able to do that. They would be able to push away the protesters from Rustaveli, but it didn't happen. It was extremely hard to predict what would happen yesterday. It was very tense. I personally was very scared at some point because they brought in thousands and thousands of police officers, and it felt like there would be some kind of clash. But in the end, they had to give up this whole idea, and the protesters won that yesterday's very specific battle. And it happens every day. And as you mentioned, I've been doing this for 15 years, and this is the first time I'm so directly target of the police interest. Just a week ago, or was it 10 days ago, I appeared on this police wanted list, and in 2 days I was not even going home because I was thinking that they would arrest me. But people made noise, media published information about it, and they had to back and just officially summon me for the criminal investigation questioning, which is actually about organizing group violence. I can't believe I'm saying this, but organizing group violence and calling publicly for a group violence. And I gave testimony, and obviously they were not interested in anything that had to do anything with my journalistic work. This is crazy. This is crazy what they are doing also with media. Being a journalist right now in Georgia has never been so dangerous in many directions, physically, legislative wise. The hate campaign that government has against us, it has never been so bad. And talking about attacks on journalists, so many of my friends have been injured. I'm talking about photographers and journalists. But whatever this does, it just makes people angrier, and they are not giving up. So I wouldn't say that we need to lose hope. On the contrary, I'm more optimistic, to be honest. It's still very hard to predict what's going to happen, but it's getting harder and harder for this government to hold on to this power. But again, it's a very, very tense
give
period.
me a quick reaction to what you thought when Syria happened, and whether it was a source of because I've heard two things. I have heard people saying, oh, this is scary for us because now Putin will focus on Georgia. And I've also heard, oh, this is the most inspiring thing ever because it shows that people power still works.
The second one is absolutely. And I personally don't think Putin has time for us. And the one thing I think about when we talk about Russia and Georgia, before we were getting to the election, if you remember, Georgian Dream tried to slide in the idea of returning Abkhazia. They were like, oh, if we stick with Russia,
separatist part of Georgia, that very similar, that was sort of broke away in a war that was very similar to the war now happening in eastern Ukraine for those years.
Yeah, so they tried to slide in this idea and maybe test the grounds what would be the reaction, but Russia was like, yeah, we still recognize Abkhazia, we're not withdrawing any military forces from there and so on. It didn't work, and it felt like Russia doesn't really care that much about Georgia. They're just like, they want to keep Georgian Dream in power, sure, but I don't think we need to be scared about what happened in Syria. On the contrary, I think it was inspiring. I didn't have much time to follow it closely because I've been just working at night and sleeping during the day for the past 2 or 3 weeks since the protest started. But still, I think it gives hope.
Yeah, but of course, one of the reasons why Putin doesn't have much time for Georgia, if that's the case, is because of Ukraine. And Oleksandra, I'd love to hear from you. We heard a bit of a view from Syria, and with those dramatic shifts in Damascus and in the Middle East in general, and with the uncertainty, especially now over the US support for Ukraine with Trump coming in, how is Kiev preparing how does it view its position now, strategic position, and how do you see the future in the next few months?
Thank you very much for these questions. I will answer, but first let me express my sincere solidarity with people in Georgia fighting for their freedom and democratic future. I know what this fight is about because just 11 years ago, people in Ukraine also stood up their voice against pro-Russian, corrupt and authoritarian government who stopped the Euro-integration process, and people peacefully demonstrated just for a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And we also faced with unbelievable level of state violence. That time I was coordinator of civil initiative Euromaidan SOS. We brought up several thousands of people who volunteering with us and providing legal assistance and other kind of help to persecuted protesters 24 hours per day. And every day, hundreds and hundreds of people who were beaten, arrested, tortured, accused in fabricated criminal cases and passed through our care. And what I want to finish that, based on our experience, that time we have no possibility to rely on legal mechanisms or to international community involvement, but we can always rely on people. And this is my main message to my friends and colleagues in Georgia, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. We still get used to thinking in categories of states and inter-states organizations, but ordinary people have a much great impact that they can even imagine, and ordinary people can make a history. Returning to your question, frankly speaking, I don't know what will be the next president administration of US policy toward Ukraine and Europe in general. But what I know for sure that Ukrainians will not stop resisting to Russian aggression. We have no other choice, literally, because Putin openly says there is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian culture. For 10 years, we have been documenting how these words converted in horrible practice. When Russian troops physically exterminate active local people, mayors, journalists, priests, children writers, teachers, musicians, any active people of community, how they ban Ukrainian language and culture, how they rope and destroyed Ukrainian cultural heritage. and how they take Ukrainian children to Russia, put them in Russian re-education camps, told them that they are not Ukrainian children, they're Russian children, that their parents refused from them, and they will be supposed to adopted by Russian families who will bring them up as Russians. So frankly speaking, we have no other choice. If we stop resisting, it will be no more us. And what I want to finish my remarks with the thing that everything is very interconnected. And that's why the struggle for freedom and democratic future of people in Georgia, it's also our struggle. And the problem is that it was Russia who was always proactive. Russia committed something horrible, then presented it like fait accompli, like new reality, and pushed international community to reckon with it. And West always was reactive and continued to play this rule of the game. And I'm think it's time to break this circle. It's time to become proactive and to support each other.
I mean, at the time when there is so much uncertainty in the United States itself, where so many Americans feel that they're on a very wobbly ground, especially people who are involved in that international community tend to sort of really care about the what's happening outside of the country. What would be your message for the Americans who are worried about their government becoming a lot more isolationist?
I will remind
it's okay if you don't have one too.
Let me describe what's going on with the freedom in the world. I'm a human rights lawyer, and this is my main focus. We are losing freedom. This year's half of population in the earth goes to election, but don't be naive. 80% of people in the world live in non-free or partially free societies. This means that people who have a real right to vote is a minority. And the problem is not just in the fact that in authoritarian countries, the space for freedom is shrinking to the size to the prison cell. The problem is that even in democracies, people start to question the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there are reasons for this, because current generations inherited democracy from their parents. They start to perceive human rights and freedom for granted. They have never fought for it. They became consumers of democracy. They consider freedom as a possibility to make a choice between different cheeses in supermarket. So my main message to people in United States and to other countries as well will be very simple. Freedom is very fragile. We can't attain human rights and freedom once and forever. We make our choice every day. And that's why we have to support the fight for freedom of each other, because we live in a very interconnected world, and only spread of freedom make our world safer.
Peter, you live in Washington, D.C., and I know that you very much subscribe to everything that Oleksandra just said. What are you seeing in DC? And I know right now you're in Kiev, so you two have this like double perspective, being originally Ukrainian and like bridging these words. Basically, I just want you to react to everything you've heard so far.
It's such an interesting discussion, and thank you for bringing it together. I don't know, over the course of the discussion, if you listen to what we've all been saying, we're sort of trying to, what keeps on coming up is interconnectedness, how something in Syria and Georgia and Ukraine and DC is linked. But also we all kind of seem to be searching, on the one hand, a kind of values-based perspective, people power, the struggle against authoritarianism, and then also one about self-interest, which is really about security. Yeah, it's about the security of democracies and the security of America. And And I wonder whether we're actually in a moment where we can start bringing these things back together, because they've become actually opposite. If you listen to someone like J.D. Vance, he sort of says we need to get away from the foreign policy of values. Yeah, that's been a disaster. We need to just think about our self-interest and security. They're not actually classic isolationists, most of the Trump guys. They're for intervention as long as it, strengthens American security. But I think what's so interesting here is these things aren't necessarily opposed, and they don't need to be opposed. Ukraine's freedom will make the West more secure. If Georgia can maintain its freedom, it is, as Batu has pointed out, so important for counterbalancing Russia's ability and China's ability to dominate possession of natural resources, dominate the Black Sea, therefore undermining American security and economy. And Syria, I mean, there's so many arguments to be made about a more open Middle East. So I wonder if we're at an interesting point here where we can get beyond, I think, this very, very cruel but also stupid idea that you should split apart values and interests, that they're antithetical, and actually start to see these things together. We'll certainly have to when we talk with the new American administration, because definitely purely talking to them in terms of values is not going to get you very far. But maybe these things aren't as contradictory as J.D. Vance thinks.
We have so many questions from the audience, and I would really like to get to them. But before we do, I wanted to very quickly, Edward, if you have a reaction to what Peter just said. I mean, I have thoughts, but I'll keep them. I don't want to sort of take away the time, especially from many questions that the viewers are sending in, the attendees. But is that a bit of a naive view from Peter? I mean, wasn't the argument, or you are muted, by the way, but wasn't the argument always that freedom and democracy is in America's interest, and it's now that, the new, and that's what sort of informed the foreign policy for years and years, and now, change of heart, it isn't. So
I think there's a terrible danger of a kind of magical wishful thinking where we think it ought to be obvious to everybody that Georgia is at a geopolitical crossroads, and therefore it's in the vital interest of the West to intervene, keep it out of Russia's clutches, and make it the fulcrum for Western Euro-Atlantic security in the Caucasus. And I'm sure everybody on this call agrees with that. The problem is that just because we think it, other people don't. And I think we have to be very bleak and realistic about the thinking in the Trump administration. And there is a strand, for example, that wants to see Europe humiliated. They want Europe to be really scared because they think that then Europe will drop its opposition to American companies, or its attempt to regulate American companies on digital issues. Now, that may not be the dominant strand, but it's there. It's highly, highly transactional, and they're willing to weaponize, or they would like to sort of weaponize Russia against Europe in order to get Europe on its knees. Now, there are 30 other possible policies, but I do worry that we're in danger of thinking that people like J.D. Vance will eventually see reason, because reason is ultimately reasonable. But they are coming from a different place.
We might be able to circle back to that because I don't want to turn it into a debate between the two of you. But I want to go for a moment to the Syria questions. And I can't see whether Oz and Zeina are still with us. But
I'm here, yeah, I'm here.
You are here. That's great. And Zeina, you're also here. So the question for both of you, starting with Zeina, we have a question asking, why did Syria collapse so quickly? And how does this possible consolidation of forces impact the situation in Ukraine? So Zeina, maybe start with you with how it collapsed so quickly. And Oz, if you want, and then Peter, basically just raise your hand and jump in, whoever has something to say on the question. Oleksandra, you as well. So Zeina, how
actually
so quickly?
Yeah, actually, it happened quickly, but we need to look back to what happened in the 14 years. So it's just like a result of what happened in the whole past years. So it's not like we were living in a peace or the situation was good. And everyone who was thinking that Syria was living in a stable situation in the past years, it was really wrong, because we were living in a very bad situation, and it was kind of, you ended a war in a very wrong way. So it had to collapse. So we were expecting this to happen all the time. Each year we thought this like a kind of building that's gonna collapse on us, but it wasn't happening. So it just needed like maybe just a stone to make it collapse, and this is what happened. Actually, of course, we didn't expect this to happen this quickly in 1 or 2 weeks, and we expected maybe it would be more violent somehow. We were really afraid that it would be more violent. So it happens more smoothly than we expected. But yeah, actually now we have the main challenge to build what had collapsed.
Mm. Yeah, it's always, that's like a great failure of media and the way we cover things, because I think the world sort of forgot about the reality on the ground in Syria, and it had so little coverage, in part because, you know, there's just limited resources that go, and there's only bandwidth for like 1 or 2 so-called foreign stories. Alex,
Yeah,
yeah,
I wanted to come in here and say
sure.
that there was
Jump in.
several factors that led to things going so quickly. I mean, it happened slowly at first and then very quickly, as the saying goes. But it was a course
That
of
old Hemingway line.
yeah,
Suddenly and then all at once.
it was the course of 14 years of war. Two things: one, that hollowed out the Assad regime's army. They lost most of their army in the beginning of the war to defections or being killed. And at that point, the regime begged for Russia and Iranian intervention, and Iran provided the troops via Hezbollah, via the IRGC, via the Fatimiyuns and Nibiyun brigades, Afghan and Pakistani militias, and Iraqi militias, and local Syrian Shia militias. Again, that's a lot of militias on the ground that Iran's controlling. They provided the brute force manpower, including, you know, forcibly recruited ethnic Hazaras that were living in Afghanistan and in Iran. And then there was the Caesar sanctions, which were really, really vital. This prevented the Assad regime from being able to rebuild its army, even with its vast amount of corruption. That corruption was going to remain. They were never going to not be corrupt and then reinvest that money that they could be embezzling. So they carried on embezzling, and the Caesar sanctions made sure that they couldn't grow their army beyond that. That also forced Assad to start seeking support from elsewhere, such as the Gulf states seeking Arab normalization. He did this in the hope that there would be further investment and that he would be further protected, because again, he believed that the rebellion against him was all funded and controlled by the Gulf states, which it categorically wasn't, and that's been proven by events. But by doing that, he also started to marginalize Iran, who bailed him out because he closed the Houthi embassy, etc., etc. The Gulf states were like, we will help you, but you need to, move back away from Iran for a bit. So Iran at this point had already spent a huge amount of money on Syria and a huge amount of manpower. And their ally in Syria had not been as grateful to them as they had hoped, particularly when October the 7th happened. Bashar al-Assad did not join and open a front against Israel the way Hezbollah did and the way Hamas started the war. So then October the 7th happens. Obviously, Assad refuses to get in, but more importantly than refusing to get in and disappointing his Iranian allies, Hezbollah is absolutely destroyed by Israel. Attacks in Syria continue by Israel. Iran is completely dragged into this conflict and has no ability to respond quickly in Syria because most of its assets are either destroyed, deployed elsewhere, and this happened so quickly. And the other thing is obviously the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's air assets and its military assets that have been using to support the Syrian regime and the Iranian militias were now suddenly elsewhere deployed in Ukraine and having quite a rough time in Ukraine, should it be said. So I believe that both Iran and Russia, even despite Assad's unreliability, would have decided to come back in again and help Assad if they could. But because the regime collapsed so quickly, they didn't even have time to respond to that. So it was four things, in my opinion. One, sanctions. Two, the hollowing out of the regime during the war. Three, October 7th and the war Israel against the militias. And four, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All four of those factors came together, which allowed the rebels an opportunity. We have to remember 3 million people living in Idlib, and nothing had been done. The international community hadn't settled it in any way. So those 3 million people are always going to react at some point. And the discipline of HTS and groups under their command was a much more effective fighting force than the Assad regime was prepared for, because this offensive had been telegraphed weeks, if not months beforehand. The regime knew it was coming, and they had time to prepare for it. And even despite that, they still collapsed. So it was a factor of many, many things that came together to create a perfect cauldron for the regime to collapse.
The perfect storm, reminiscent of what happened in Afghanistan, of course, as well. And you mentioned sanctions, which are so relevant for Georgia right now. And Batu, I want to talk to you about that and whatever else you have your hand raised for. But before I do, can I just quickly go to Oleksandra and then Peter? We have a question that asks, how has can the collapse of Russian-supported regime in Syria have an impact on the genocidal Russian war against Ukraine and Russian attempts to undermine Georgia? Oleksandra, what do you think? Like, how do you think, what impact do you think these events will have?
I live in Kiev, and my native city is constantly being shelled not just by Russian rocket, but also by Iranian drones. China helps Russia to avoid sanctions and import technologies critical to warfare. North Korea sent to Russia more than 1 million artillery shells and have just recently sent their troops to Russia. And Syria, before Assad regime was fallen, was always voted for Russia in UN General Assembly. So we are dealing with the formation of entire authoritarian bloc, and all these regimes have something in common. They have the same idea of what a human being is. This Assad regime collapsed show at least several things. First, that Russia is not so strong as Russia pretend to be, playing in a chess game in different parts of the globe. Second, that Russia is not a reliable partner, even for the authoritarian alliance. They couldn't help Assad because they dig in the war in Ukraine. And now we know that this negotiation is going on about preservance of Russian military base in Syria, from which they before bombarded civilians, hospitals, residential buildings, churches, and schools in Syria. So I hope that Russia will fail to preserve this military base, which provides them opportunity for more larger influence in our part of the globe. But still, regardless of the effect to Russian war in Ukraine, I mean that there are rumors that I'm not military expert, it's difficult for me to comment. Do Russia will have an additional troops which they can now send to Ukraine? But generally, the failure of dictatorship is good without any exceptions.
Peter, just building on what Oleksandra just said and some of what you were saying earlier, do you feel that this kind of, you know, a little bit of this erosion of that authoritarian bloc that you write and talk so eloquently about creates that opportunity to go to the new Trump administration with a sort of gives Ukraine more negotiating power, gives the pro-democracy supporters here more of a negotiating power. The weakened Russia, I mean, Russia does seem to be weaker than it was 2 or 3 weeks ago because of the losses in Syria and so various other things. Romania, you know, what happened in Romania and so on. Do you think it shifts? Do you think that there is a shift here before Trump takes office?
Yeah, but the main thing is to take advantage of it. As you say, it's sort of multivectoral. It's Romania. It's potentially, depending on what we do, or how we help the protesters in Georgia with more targeted sanctions. It's Syria. Also, you know, I still spend a lot of my time monitoring what's going on inside of Russia, both through sociology and social media analysis and all sorts of data fusion exercises. And actually, it's very interesting to see how the North Korean influx of soldiers was reacted to in Russia. It was another case of the Kremlin not being able to control the internal narrative, because the Kremlin said, nothing to see here, this is not happening. And, you know, the whole debate inside of Russia was like, oh, it's happening, and it makes us look like morons, are we this week?
And you are, of course, referring to the fact that Russians have been shipping
the North Korean soldiers.
In Ukraine.
Then there's more strains on the economy. And again, it's very interesting if you listen to the Russian discourse, you know, the voices that are now talking about pressures in the economy. These are economic blocs who basically can't make supply chains work anymore, that are raising their voices. This is not sort of the politically irrelevant liberal bloc. This is the economic bloc, which are starting to say, we don't know how long we can keep this up. Fascinating, actually, if you're getting very Kremlinologist. There was a piece in Kommersant by Pukhov, who's basically a think tanker that represents the general staff, saying in Kommersant, you know, if you don't win wars in 3 months, you don't win them. So that's the general staff telling Putin, we don't know what we're doing in Ukraine. So there's pressure inside of Russia. The moment now that we've done again and again and again since 22 is whenever there's an opportunity to put Russia on the back foot, we stop. And that, of course, has been the catastrophic failing of the Biden administration. Every time there's a moment that Putin is shaken, the Prigozhin mutiny, the Kursk incursion, they stop and go, well, would you like to come and talk now? And of course, he doesn't. Maybe somebody with Edward's amazing networks, I certainly don't have them, can communicate to the strain in Trumpian thinking. And there is this strain in Trumpian thinking that when there's a chance to show strength, you do. This is the moment to show it. This is how you differentiate yourself from the slightly ineffectual approach that Biden had when it came to taking advantage. So maybe that's a way in to the many and often sort of contradictory impulses that Trump seems to have.
I'm going to let Batu ask the question because he's had the hand raised to sort of say what he had. But Batu, can you also refer, I know sanctions, we brought up the sanctions very briefly, and they're really important. So if you could sort of see where a little bit of a opportunity, like when it comes to what can the West do, whatever that West now is, because it's now so not like a single collective thing anymore. But if you can sort of tell us a little bit about the sanctions as well. And then we'll go back to the audience questions. Sorry, can I also say that we're now at an hour, we're adding 30 minutes. They are for the subscribers, but if you have asked the question and haven't received an answer, and if you can stay, and I know some of you will have to go, some of our speakers have to go, then please do stay, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and if not, we'll try to get some of them answered in the summary of the event that we'll send to you as well. So Batu, over to you, and I'll appreciate if you have to go, please do, and if you can stay, please stay on for another 30 minutes.
Thank you, Natalia. Actually, the sanctions issue is connected also what Peter was just saying about putting freedom on offensive, as Margaret Thatcher remarked when toasting to the Ronald Reagan. So yes, offensive policies is a winning strategy, and that's what I think we have to be communicating here in Georgia, in Ukraine, because we are on the front line of this bigger battle, democracy versus authoritarianism. So sanctions is not a panacea per se. Sanctions should be part of a bigger offensive policy towards authoritarians who are like a connected vessel connected to each other. They share experience, they coordinate with each other, and therefore any success they can make, whether it's in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria, any other place, it emboldens their ability to project the way they want to see new world order. This is a world order based on spheres of influence. That's why Syria is so important. That was the only place where Russia was trying to project their power geographically in the distant area. But this distant geography was possible because their ability to control Black Sea since the annexation of Crimea, changing equation there. So all this considered, of course, and considering again Georgia's geopolitical position, that's an argument why the current authoritarian regime or the Russian proxy regime in Georgia needs to be sanctioned. And sanctions have a besides the moral empowering connotation for the people on the street, sanctions will allow the West to project its ability to do things in a more proactive manner. Well, these sanctions would have been much better if they would have been imposed several months ago and much more effective, but still we've seen that there were some of those sanctions imposed too small and too late.
Too little, too late.
Yeah, but now I think the financial or asset-free sanctions are key in terms of the ability to deprive Ivanishvili to finalize this Russian state capture in Georgia, because these authoritarians, though they try to, our own authoritarian here in Georgia as well, try to project that they have some political ideology, sometimes playing ultra-left, ultra-right, but that's fake. They have no ideology that glues them together. The only thing that glues together is the kleptocratic money and corruption. And then the source of this type of kleptocratic money that has been laundered in Georgia en masse is Russia. Therefore, the sanctions should be part of the bigger policy of curbing the ability, this network of the enablers of the Putin aggression. And Georgia, unfortunately, currently is one of those enablers. So once these sanctions are imposed, well, with this, we will help Ukraine to fight better. We will help Moldova. We will help Syria and people in the Middle East. And also we will deprive Russia ability to project its kleptocratic power, because this kleptocracy is really quite a powerful tool which has been allowed last several, starting even with the reset policy, when some kind of a one-sided normalization was a very naive approach towards Russia, which allowed them to spread the network of their financial enablers globally. And now
or actually, arguably, it started much earlier than that. And we have a great question from one of our attendees who asks, how much impact did the US policy of fostering capitalism over democratic institutions after the fall of the USSR have on the rise of Putin and the expanding age of oligarchy? And this is, this is something that Coda covers sort of in quite a lot of detail. And it's also the trend that, we tracked all the way back. In some ways, we see a new iteration of that sort of oligarchy now popping its head in the United States with some of the Silicon Valley oligarchs, broligarchs, you can call them, like Elon Musk taking over, very powerful positions in the government, and despite pretty clear conflict of interest issues. And we've seen a much more rogue version of that happen in the 1990s in this part of the world, where sort of capitalism was put on steroids. And the result, one of the results of that is, of course, the man who rules Georgia now, the de facto leader, Zeina Ivanishvili, who is a oligarch who made all of his money in Russia. So I think it's a really smart question about how much of what's happening here today can be tracked to that new wave of oligarchs back in the 1990s, and the US and Russia kind of jumping on that same trend. Ed, do you want to take it? Peter, Oleksandra, Batu? Yeah. Okay. Edward and then Batu.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that money has proved to be democracy's Achilles heel. And in the old Cold War, it was our huge advantage that the planned economies didn't work and ours did. And now it's flipped round, and the biggest danger we face is from people, whether they're Elon Musk type people in America or Ivanishvili type people in Georgia. And the power of money seems to be greater than the ability of democratic institutions to withstand them. So there's a kind of common problem there.
Patty, do you want to address the question?
Very briefly. Well, I would really hesitate to put this sign of equality between the oligarchs or labeling them as oligarchs, who are people with the big amount of wealth influencing policies in the Western democracies, and post-Soviet oligarchs, because that's are two different products of two different systems. And the oligarchs,
the result seems quite similar.
No, I don't think so. Because, for example, the oligarchs who are now I call them the Putin's oligarchs. Well, we call them by inertia oligarchs, but they are not oligarchs at all. They are just compartments in the Putin's wallet. They are just executing the orders. They are financial lieutenants of the Putin system, rather than themselves having their own political agenda or even their political ideology. Just recently, there was an investigation by special services in Moldova that the Abramovich was helping the Moldovan oligarch to take Russia-connected oligarch to take control of the country. So they have different goals. They are on offensive in the Putin system to destroy and undermine the liberal democratic order. So that's why these are two different products and with two different DNAs. And I personally think that what Putin was allowed to create successfully, unfortunately, which he formally declared, by the way, in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, and then he acted on his promises or his statements, is changing attacking the liberal democracy, undermining liberal democracy as a political system. And he formally claimed that the era of liberal democracy is over. And these individuals are more of the puppets or the financial lieutenants in this war, rather than the individuals who have their own agenda. And Ivanishvili is one of those. By the way, Ivanishvili is one of those, the most successful financial lieutenants in Putin's system, because he managed to almost capture entire state. None of the other post-Soviet oligarchs managed to informally own entire state.
He's also a really great example of this kind of a new kind of autocracy that the world faces. I heard a great podcast recently where Ivan Krasev, the Bulgarian political scientist, brought up this famous quote by the Supreme Justice about U.S. Supreme Justice about pornography. He said, I don't know how to describe it, but I know when I see it. And he said the autocracy is just, the authoritarian is just the opposite. We know how to describe it, but we don't always know when we see it. And we sort of know the people like Bashar al-Assad are the old age, kind of old-fashioned autocrats whom we recognize. But Ivanishvili has managed to fool the West in Georgia for years and years. And increasingly, I think I talk to a lot of people in the US who are really worried that, through introduction of various laws and so on. Obviously there's no comparison between the US and Georgia, but that there will be some sort of erosion of institutions in the United States under Trump. It's kind of the new kind of authoritarianism will sneak in on them too. Peter, you live in DC. Does that worry you? Does it worry you that America will become a more authoritarian country?
Well, look, America has its own rich traditions of the executive overstepping the mark. You know, if you look at the history of America from, I don't know, Huey Long in the 1930s in Louisiana through to overreach by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, there's plenty of instances. This is not something that needs to be thought about as a foreign thing. There is a strain of autocratic practices, if not an autocratic system, inside America, and you know the vulnerabilities aren't something alien. They're there within the system. There's the presence of, you know, completely non-transparent political funding, the dominance of a kind of like sort of overlooking objective facts and pleading fealty to lies, basically. We have all these tendencies already. You have a judicial system which a lot of people don't have faith in, and which can seem very politicized. So you have all these vulnerabilities, and all it takes is for them to be exacerbated a little bit, and we move, you know, democracy degrades. But so I don't think this is something that is alien to the US. I don't think the US is at risk of a kind of autocratic, full-on centralized takeover for many, many reasons. But the increase of autocratic practices to game the system are already there and have been historically there, and now is a particularly vulnerable moment because of people's lack of faith and love for the institutions of democracy, which is very apparent in lots of opinion polling. So yes, but not in a kind of, you know, Ivanishvili style, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I've got a few more we have so many questions that we will not be able to get to, but I have one for Oleksandra, which I just lost. Sorry about that. So I think Zeina is still with us. I'm gonna, Zeina, if you are, one question that we have here on Syria is, what is your opinion of Jolani's endgame? He obviously has been attempting to soften the image of HTS from, but how far is it likely to go? What kind of governance do you expect? If you have comments on that, I'm sure our guest would appreciate it.
Yeah, actually, it's so hard to tell because we are also, like, we have witnessed a very fast collapse of the regime. We are witnessing also fast, like, change in HTS behavior. We are seeing in the streets, and also like how they are dealing with journalists here. They are behaving very well, and I think they want to show us and to show the world that they are doing good things. And actually, good things are really happening now. So the economy is somehow improving. We are seeing a lot of good things that are happening now in Syria. But of course, it doesn't mean that we are trusting what they are doing or what they will do. So we are watching, and we are insisting on telling everyone we need to watch, we need to report about every violation and everything that's happening. So now we don't need to be afraid because Assad has collapsed and he fled the country. So now we need to talk about everything. We need to insist on building Syria that's inclusive for everyone, and not to let any any part or anyone to just like monopolize what's happening. So yeah, they are changing. We are watching what's happening. Actually, we really don't know what's going to happen in the next days, because a lot of like political movement are going on. We are hearing about like elevating the sanctions on HTS also. So we really don't know what's gonna happen. We are watching like all the Arab countries and foreign countries also coming and talking with them, and we are maybe in 2 days French people from France will come also to Syria. Some embassies are opened.
No, it's yeah.
So yeah, we are watching and seeing, but also the civil society in Syria is started to move. A lot of movements are happening inside and outside Syria. So we are not like just sitting and watching. We are trying to do something. I'm talking about journalists. I'm talking about civil society, political leaders inside and outside Syria.
Oleksandra, so we've just been talking about sort of the new kind of authoritarianism. We've talked about a version of like a new oligarchs also becoming much more prominent in the US, even though I think, Batu, you make a good point about the distinction and differences, yet there's still similarities that we had not seen before. We're talking about the birth of a kind of a government that we don't even know what is going to be in Syria in this completely redrawn new Middle East. You, as a human rights defender, obviously in Ukraine, but someone who operates on a very high sort of international level with all this like tectonic plates shifting everywhere, then politics becoming so different. And as this whole sort of sphere of the human rights loses its traditional allies, primarily in the United States, where do you see, like, what kind of realignment do you see? Like, where are your new, like, where are you going to be looking for allies for someone who made a very poignant and powerful point that, you know, freedom of all people is interconnected and global? Like, how do you see the building of that new alliances to replace the ones that are clearly disintegrating?
I think that we have to speak more about with the ordinary people. Because when we speak about democratization, it's not enough to adopt qualities laws and to build some formal institutions. Values of society always prevail. Values of society provide an energy for these laws and institutions to work in the right directions. I think that now it's a task for every civil society actor to create a very easy entry point for people to be involved in this fight for freedom and democracy. I think that the problem is that we have billions of people in the earth, and some countries are very huge. They have a lot of population, but they have very less citizens. What do I mean? Citizens, it's not person who receive passport. It's a person who start to understand his or her responsibility for everything which is going on in this country and what this country is doing on behalf of his or her name. And I think that we need a very huge enlightenment campaign about freedom to make it attractive. Without this, we will never succeed. So everything which we in Ukraine, I mean my concrete human rights organization, achieved for these 20 years, it was only because ordinary people massively started to support our work.
So making freedom great again.
Something like this.
As Trump would say. We're really nearing the end of our time, but there is a question that I would love both you and Batu to answer, and maybe Mariam, if Mariam is still here. I can't see you, but if you are, very related to what you just said. What's the counterpoint? That's the question. What's the counterpoint to the GOP, the Republican narrative, that all this instability in Eastern Europe is because of NATO? So whoever wants to take it first, I'd love to hear your take. Please.
I would like to be first in this chain because it's something which I hear a lot as excuse why Russia started this war. So first, I will remind that this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, when Ukraine got a chance for democratic transition due to collapse of the authoritarian regime after Revolution of Dignity. And in 2014, Ukraine was neutral country. It was written in our constitution. We have a zero chance to join to NATO. But Russia started this war of aggression, occupied Crimea, part of eastern regions of Ukraine, and 2 years ago extended this war to the large-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom, which came closer to Russian borders. Because Autocracies always consider people as object of control. They deny people in rights and freedoms. Democracies, in opposite, even not ideal, they consider people, their rights and freedoms to be the highest value. And there is no way to negotiate it, because only existence of free world always provides a threat for dictatorship to lose their power.
Thank you. Batu, you had your hand raised. Do you want to address the NATO question? I know it's a big one.
Yes, this question is very dear to my heart, because I've spent, let's say, most of my career advancing Georgia on the path to NATO, and one of the biggest, let's say, disappointment was the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit, where I think NATO made a strategic mistake not to extend the membership action plan and the further roadmap to membership to Ukraine and Georgia, that has been interpreted by Putin after his, again referring to his 2007 Munich Security Conference speech, as a kind of a green light that he can move with his offensive plans against the free world and democracy. So I think that, and let's inverse this question vice versa. Let's imagine what Eastern Europe or European security would have been looked like if there was NATO. We would have seen much more aggressive Russia, challenging not only in Ukraine or not only in Georgia, the European order and security, but we would have seen it in Poland, in Czech Republic, as we already witnessed it in the 20th century. So yeah, NATO is and was the agent of stability on the European continent. And NATO was able to project this stability because of its transatlantic link and US exceptional power. Well, some might like it or not, but this American exceptionalism is there, and it laid the ground for this type of stability and prosperity in Europe. So I don't see any other international security institutions currently functioning ones that can deliver besides NATO. That's why Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO, because there is no other multilateral guarantee for security, which really, besides the political will or desire, has the instrumental military ability. And military might matters. Again, we might like it or not, but still we live in a real world where military power is important to containing the aggressive authoritarians who are on offensive. And not only in Europe, let's project it in the Indo-Pacific. Let's see what is happening around Taiwan. That's all the same equation.
Edward, do you have any words of wisdom for us before we wrap up? I think you're very well positioned, given the work that you've done, to answer the counterpoint question about, the counterpoint, the people, I mean, comes a lot through kind of Russia-backed channels, that this is all about NATO. And I've been talking to a lot of protesters now in the streets who always talk about how Georgia's European aspiration long precede not only both NATO and the European Union. And there's always been this, a kind of alignment for the West.
I think we used NATO's shorthand for the West, and that made sense, perhaps in the 90s, and certainly the NATO boosters will always say it's the most successful military alliance in history, and it's a good flag. But I think we're actually moving into a post NATO era. NATO doesn't have the means to respond to the kind of war that's actually going on right now in Europe, this so-called sub-threshold or hybrid war. NATO is too big to make decisions quickly, and if we do get into a military conflict with Russia, it'll happen extremely suddenly. And by the time NATO's made a decision, it'll be too late. So I think we're actually in a post-NATO era where we're looking at coalitions of the willing, of the capable, of the threat-aware. And that has both advantages and disadvantages. We don't have the sort of huge clout of having the whole transatlantic alliance, but we do have the chance to do things. So I think that the NATO aspiration is a bit like trying to getting to a party at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's already breaking up. Obviously, parties in Georgia go on much later than that, but I'm talking about London. And so I caution against that. But I think that the basic ideas that have been so brilliantly articulated by Oleksandra are still absolutely valid. It's just that we need a different institutional framework for them internationally, and we need some better institutions to promote them, defend them at home.
We have 3 minutes left and many, many more questions. And again, we promise that we'll try to get as many of them answered as we can, and we'll put them in an email to you. We've done this before. But Peter, before we go, I want to end, and I think others have, our other speakers have peeled off, and I'm so grateful to everyone for joining us in the middle of the protests, in the middle of the bus rides from Damascus, in the middle of train journeys in Kiev, and so on. It's been amazing to have you all here. Peter, before we go, Edward just said post-NATO, you are the one who coined the post-truth term. So, and I believe,
I don't think so.
well, I'll give it to you, even if you hadn't. Have it. But so the post-truth era has now cemented, and the sort of that argument, one of the reasons why it has been so successful, that this is not a fight for freedom wherever it's happening, it's a fight for some geopolitical interests and for NATO, has been part of the, part of that bigger disinformation spread battle, the fact that everyone these days has their own bespoke truth. When with trying to form actual question in my head, hoping...
No, listen. It's yeah. I mean, I was having dinner with my favorite Ukrainian philosopher last night, Vladimir Yermolenko, who you know as well, of course, and he was like, he put it beautifully. Instead of thinking about debunking disinformation, we should be thinking about how do we tell better stories. And that's not that isn't just about stories and fictions, as in like stories of action. What is the new NATO used to be a story, it was an idea united by Article 5. I think Edward is completely right that story hasn't disappeared, but neither does it burn bright and full of power. So what are the new stories? And stories, I mean actions, what are the new ideas, connections, geopolitical sentences that produce effect? It's very interesting talking to Ukrainians. I mean, my heritage is Ukrainian, but I'm a Brit really. But talking to Ukrainians who've been experiencing the war as a living thing much more than I have, and finding out from their point of view what is real. NATO, bit of a fiction. EU as an actor, non-existent. The West, where? But you do find other things, these growing connections of industrial production that are forming, of high-tech know-how that are being swapped between Silicon Valley and London and the front lines. These new economic connections, understandings of fear and action that are spreading throughout northeastern Europe. Ukraine is now almost a part of Scandinavia, I would say. Maybe it was originally, but it's so interesting. New stories are forming, stories of action, stories of policy, stories of meaning, and it's up to us actually as writers to tell those stories. Why are we still telling the story of the NATO and the EU when that is no longer the story? So are we doing our jobs correctly? Because something new is forming. It's forming every day. But you have to sort of bury in to see where it's forming.
Thank you so much. That's a great point to end on because stories is what we're all about at Coda, but also at ZEG. ZEG is our partner with this event, and ZEG Storytelling Festival is all about how we create narratives for the future. And the ZEG, of course, means the day after tomorrow in Georgian, and that's what these protests are all about, and that's what the revolution in Syria is all about, and that's what the war in Ukraine is really all about. Maybe not the immediate tomorrow, but something to live for further down the line. Thank you so much to all of you. Again, thank you to all the speakers, but especially to all of you who have attended. It was great to have this. We promise we'll try to get to more questions in writing this time, and see you next time. Thank you.